If you compressed Earth's history into a single 24-hour day, for the first 21 hours, absolutely nothing happened. Just invisible slime floating in quiet water. But at exactly 9 p.m., evolution suddenly lost its mind. In a geological blink of an eye, the ocean went from boring mud to a nightmare of armored tanks, monsters with 5 eyes, and 3-foot murder shrimp. This is the Cambrian Explosion. It is the single most violent burst of creativity in history, and it terrified Charles Darwin. In fact, he admitted this one mystery could destroy his entire theory. So why did life suddenly go from 0 to 100? Imagine you are standing on a beach about 600 million years ago. You take a deep breath. Big mistake. There's barely enough oxygen yet, so you pass out. But let's assume you have a time-traveling hazmat suit. You look around for T-Rex or a giant dragonfly or even a decent-looking fern. You see absolutely nothing. Just wet rocks, grey water, and a whole lot of silence. For roughly 3 billion years, this was Earth's status quo. It was a planet dominated by microbial slime. Scientists literally call a huge chunk of this era the boring billion. It's like the universe paused the video game while it went to the kitchen to make a sandwich. If Earth's history were a 24-hour clock, complex life didn't show up until about 9 p.m. Up until then, just bacteria bumping into each other. Then, around 541 million years ago, something snapped. In a geological blink of an eye, a window of roughly 20 to 50 million years, evolution apparently chugged 5 energy drinks and decided to invent, well, everything. We went from single-celled blobs to armored tanks with eyes, legs, and teeth. It is the biological equivalent of going from a tricycle directly to a SpaceX rocket with 0 intermediate steps. This is the Cambrian Explosion, the moment almost every major animal group or phylum suddenly crashed the party. But you've been lied to. It wasn't completely empty before the fireworks started. Just before the Cambrian, there was a weird beta test period called the Ediacaran. These creatures were bizarre. Imagine quilted air mattresses or giant fractals living on the sea floor. They had no mouths, no guts, and no eyes. They just absorbed nutrients through their skin like a sponge with an attitude problem. Scientists still argue aggressively over what these things actually were. Were they failed animals? Giant lichens? Or a completely different experiment in life that nature deleted from the hard drive? Whatever they were, they didn't last. The biological fuse was lit, and the ocean was about to get a lot more crowded and a lot more dangerous. So, the boring billion is over, and suddenly the oceans are teeming with life. But this wasn't just a population boom, it was a full-blown creature feature. If you could snorkel in the Cambrian Ocean, assuming you didn't get eaten immediately, you would think you had landed on a different planet. Our best window into this madness is a place called the Burgess Shale in the Canadian Rockies. Back in 1909, a paleontologist named Charles Walcott stumbled across this site, and it is largely considered the Rosetta Stone of evolution. Why? Because the mud here was so fine that it didn't just preserve bones or shells, it preserved soft tissue. Eyes, guts, antennae. The squishy bits that usually rot away were turned into stone. And what Walcott found was, frankly, unhinged. Nature wasn't just iterating on existing designs. It was throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what stuck. You had creatures like Opabinia, a little swimmer that looked like a vacuum cleaner crossed with a shrimp. It had 5 eyes on stalks and a long, flexible nozzle with a claw at the end. Imagine trying to explain that to a police sketch artist. Then there was hallucigenia. This thing was so confusing that for decades scientists literally displayed it upside down. They thought its spines were legs and its legs were tentacles. It took years before someone realized, hey, maybe the sharp spikes go up so things don't eat it. But the king of this underwater playground was Anomalocaris. In a world where most things were the size of a thumb, this guy was the size of a dinner platter, sometimes up to 3 feet long. It had 2 giant spiny grabbers in front of its face and a mouth shaped like a pineapple slice filled with teeth. It was the world's first super predator. Now for the part nobody expects. For a long time, we didn't even know Anomalocaris was one animal. Its fossilized mouth looked like a preserved jellyfish. Its grasping arm looked like the tail of a shrimp. Its body looked like a sea cucumber. Scientists spent years classifying these as 3 completely different species. It wasn't until someone found a complete specimen that they realized, oh no, they're all connected, and it's terrifying. It's like finding a hubcap, a steering wheel, and a muffler in a junkyard, and assuming they are 3 different types of metal animals, only to realize they build a monster truck. This era represents a level of biological creativity we have never seen since. Stephen Jay Gould called it wonderful life, suggesting that if you rewound the tape of life and played it again, the results might look totally different. Maybe we'd all be walking around with 5 eyes and nozzles. Historians and scientists still argue fiercely about this disparity. Did all these body plans appear instantly, or were they lurking in the shadows for millions of years before the fossil record caught them? Some researchers claim these weird wonders aren't actually failed experiments, but simply the early, clunky versions of modern groups like arthropods and velvet worms. Either way, the Cambrian Ocean was a rough neighborhood. Armor was evolving. Teeth were sharpening. And for the first time in history, death wasn't just an accident, it was an industry. So we have the what? A sudden explosion of nightmares swimming around in the primordial soup. But now we have to answer the biggest question in the history of life on Earth. Why? Why did evolution sit on the couch eating Cheetos for 3 billion years, only to suddenly run a marathon in record time? What pulled the trigger? If you ask a geologist, they'll point to the air, or rather the water. The leading theory for decades has been oxygen. For most of Earth's history, oxygen levels were pitifully low. Single-celled slime doesn't need much breath. But if you want to build a complex animal, something with muscles, a brain, and a digestive system, you need high-octane fuel. You can't power a Ferrari on AA batteries. Around the start of the Cambrian, oxygen levels spiked. This wasn't just about breathing, it was about construction. You physically cannot build collagen, the protein glue that holds animals together, without high oxygen. Without that spike, life would have remained soft, squishy, and microscopic. But simply having the fuel doesn't explain why everyone suddenly bought a car. You need a motivation. Enter the light switch theory. Prior to the Cambrian, the ocean was effectively a blind ecosystem. Animals drifted around, bumping into food by accident. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, the trilobite evolved the first complex eye. This wasn't just a patch of light-sensitive skin, these were high-definition cameras. In fact, trilobite eyes were made of crystal, literally calcite, which meant they couldn't focus like our soft lenses, but they had incredible depth of field. The moment one animal could see, the rules of the game changed forever. It was no longer survival of the luckiest. It was survival of the hidden. If you couldn't see the predator coming, you were lunch. If you couldn't see your prey, you starved. This kicked off what biologists call an evolutionary arms race. Imagine a Cold War scenario. One side invents a spear, teeth. The other side invents a shield, shells. The first side responds by inventing a can opener, stronger claws. This brings us to one of the most significant inventions of the Cambrian, biomineralization. Animals started pulling minerals like calcium carbonate out of the water to build hard parts. Before this, everything was soft. After this, the ocean was full of armor. This is why the fossil record suddenly explodes. Hard shells fossilize way better than jelly. Here's the thing though. While everyone focuses on the eyes and the oxygen, the real trigger might have been something much grosser. Worms burrowing in the mud. Before the Cambrian, the ocean floor was covered in a stiff microbial mat, kind of like a sealed plastic sheet. The water above and the mud below were chemically separated. Then worms started evolving and digging. They churned up the sea floor, mixing oxygen into the mud and releasing nutrients back into the water. This is called the agronomic revolution. By destroying the old world, the microbial mats, these early burrowers engineered a new world. They literally terraformed the planet by just wiggling around. They made the ocean floor habitable for complex life, but they also destroyed the habitat of the weird Ediacaran creatures we talked about earlier. It was an ecological, hostile takeover. We also have to talk about the software update. You can't build a complex body without the genetic code to run it. Scientists discovered something called Hox genes. Think of these as the general contractors of the body. They don't build the house, but they tell the workers where to put the windows and doors. They say, head goes here, tail goes there, legs go in the middle. It turns out that a simple worm and a complex human share incredibly similar Hox genes. It's possible that right before the Cambrian, the genetic toolkit was finally completed. The software was ready. Life just needed the environmental push to click run. Scientists still argue violently about which of these factors was the primary driver. Was it the oxygen allowing for growth? Was it the eyes forcing competition? Or was it the genetic toolkit finally coming online? Most likely, it was a perfect storm. All these factors hit at once. The oxygen allowed them to get big, the minerals allowed them to get hard, and the eyes forced them to get smart. But there's a catch. If all these animals appeared so suddenly, where are their ancestors? If Darwin was right, shouldn't there be a long, slow trail of fossils leading up to this moment? The lack of that trail drove Darwin absolutely crazy. In fact, he wrote that this problem could validly be used to reject his entire theory. Charles Darwin was a smart guy. He figured out natural selection, he grew an epic beard, and he fundamentally changed how we see the world. But the Cambrian explosion kept him up at night. In On the Origin of Species, Darwin famously wrote that the sudden appearance of these animals was a valid argument against his entire theory. His logic was simple. Evolution is supposed to be slow and steady. Nature doesn't jump, it crawls. So if simple life slowly evolved into complex life, the rock layers below the Cambrian should be absolutely stuffed with half-formed ancestors. Creatures that were slightly less weird than Anomalocaris, but more advanced than slime. But when Darwin looked at the rocks, nothing. The fossil record just abruptly started. This is famously known as Darwin's dilemma. And honestly, for about 100 years, creationists and skeptics used this gap to dunk on evolutionary biology. They pointed at the Cambrian and said, "Look, instant creation." So, what is the answer? Was Darwin wrong? Well, not exactly. He had a theory for why the fossils were missing, and it basically boils down to the fossil record is a terrible librarian. Fossilization is incredibly rare. It is the geological equivalent of winning the lottery. 99.9% of everything that has ever lived just rotted away, got eaten, or dissolved. To become a fossil, you have to die in the exact right mud, get buried instantly, not be crushed, not be eroded for 500 million years, and then have a hairless ape with a hammer find you on a random Tuesday. Think of Earth's history like a 1,000-page novel. We have pages 900 to 1,000 pretty well preserved. But for the first few chapters, we don't have the book. We have a handful of confetti that fell out of the binding. Darwin bet that the ancestors were there. They were just soft-bodied and didn't leave a trace. But you've been lied to. It's not just about missing pages. Modern genetics suggests the explosion might be a total illusion. Scientists now use something called molecular clocks. By looking at the DNA differences between living animals, say a human and a fruit fly, and knowing the rate at which DNA mutates, we can calculate how long ago our last common ancestor lived. When geneticists wind this clock back, the results are shocking. The DNA says that the major animal groups didn't split 540 million years ago. They split possibly 800 million years ago or more. This creates a massive conflict, the rocks versus the clocks. The rocks say animals appeared instantly. The clocks say animals were evolving secretly for hundreds of millions of years. This leads to the slow fuse theory. The idea is that animals were evolving for eons, but they were microscopic. Imagine a world full of complex life, but everything is the size of a grain of sand, living between grains of sand. They had the genetics, the complexity, and the lineages, but they were too small to leave a fossil. Then the environmental triggers we talked about in Part 3, oxygen, minerals, hit, and suddenly, boom. The animals didn't just appear, they just got big enough to see. We actually have proof of this. We have found microscopic fossils called small shelly fauna that date to right before the explosion. These look like tiny hats, tubes, and coils, likely the armor of microscopic creatures that were starting to scale up. Historians and scientists still argue over a concept called punctuated equilibrium. This is the idea that evolution isn't actually slow and steady. Instead, it's long periods of boredom interrupted by short bursts of panicked change. If this theory is right, the Cambrian explosion wasn't an illusion or an artifact of bad preservation. It was a genuine, high-speed biological revolution, where evolution hit the gas pedal, broke the speed limit, and never looked back. The Cambrian explosion didn't just fill the oceans, it turned them into a gladiator arena. For millions of years, these experimental monsters battled for dominance. But as the era ended, nature started swinging the axe. Many of the weird wonders we talked about, the guys with 5 eyes, the vacuum nozzles, the pineapple mouths, they didn't make the cut. They were evolutionary dead ends. Brilliant designs, but for whatever reason, they couldn't hack it in the long run. They vanished, leaving no descendants. But amidst the chaos of giant shrimp and armored slugs, there was one tiny, unassuming creature swimming in the background. It looked like a flattened worm, barely 2 inches long. It had no armor, no claws, and seemingly no chance. This was Pichia. Here is the kicker. Pichia had one special feature that the armored tanks didn't. A stiff, flexible rod running down its back called a notochord. That rod was the beta version of a backbone. Pichia, or a creature very much like it, is the great-granddaddy of every fish, amphibian, reptile, bird, and mammal that has ever lived. If that little worm had been eaten by an Anomalocaris 500 million years ago, the entire vertebrate branch of the tree of life would have snapped off. There would be no dinosaurs, no cats, and definitely no humans. The legacy of the Cambrian explosion isn't just the fossils in the museum, it's you. Look in a mirror. You have a left side and a right side. You have a head at the front where your sensory organs are clustered and a digestive system that runs to the back. This body plan, bilateral symmetry, became the gold standard during the Cambrian. We are effectively just upgraded, highly modified Cambrian worms. We often think of evolution as a ladder of progress, moving inevitably toward intelligence. But the Cambrian shows us that evolution is more like a lottery. We are the descendants of the lucky few who survived the wildest, most experimental, and most dangerous era in Earth's history. The Cambrian Explosion is the moment the fuse was lit. It set the rules of the game: predator and prey, vision and armor, brain and brawn. We are still playing by those rules today. The Cambrian Explosion remains the biggest puzzle in evolution because it defies the slow and steady logic we expect from nature. Whether it was oxygen, eyes, or a genetic revolution, one thing is certain: it was the most important 50 million years our planet ever saw. Without it, Earth would likely still be a quiet, wet rock covered in slime. If you're glad your ancestors decided to grow a backbone instead of a vacuum cleaner nose, hit that subscribe button.